There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with warning signs or dramatic music. They arrive quietly, wrapped inside something ordinary, a dinner plate, a glass of wine, a simple question asked across a table full of people who suddenly can't breathe. My name is Mia Calloway. I'm 26 years old, and the moment that changed everything happened on Christmas Eve between the turkey and the cranberry sauce, when my grandfather looked across 9 people, past the candles and the polished silverware, directly at me, and said something so small it nearly tore the room in half. "So, Mia, how's the house coming along? That old place always needed a little love." I put my fork down. "What house, Grandpa?" 9 people at that table. Not one of them moved. My father's hand froze around his wine glass like it had been dipped in ice. My stepmother's fingers went white at the edge of the tablecloth, gripping it like she was trying to keep the entire evening from sliding off the edge of the world. One question, 7 words. And just like that, 2 years of lies unraveled across a Christmas table like thread pulled from the wrong end of a sweater. But before I take you there, before I walk you through what happened that night and everything that came after, I need to take you back. Back 18 years, to a Tuesday in March, to the day my mother stopped breathing and my father started disappearing. Because this story doesn't start at that dinner table. It starts at a graveside in the rain, with a little girl who had no idea how alone she was about to become. My mother's name was Diana Calloway, née Hartley. She taught 2nd grade. She had a laugh that carried through walls and a habit of humming while she cooked. Always slightly off-key, always completely unbothered by it. Every Sunday, she'd pull out a wooden recipe box from the cabinet above the stove. Oak, worn smooth at the corners. She'd let me flip through the index cards and pick what we'd make for dinner. I always picked the tomato sauce. She always pretended she didn't know I would. I was 8 years old when the cancer took her. Lung cancer, stage 4, discovered so late that the doctor started using the word unlucky as though it were a medical term. She never smoked a single day in her life. She was 41 years old. She had a classroom full of kids who made her a card with crayon drawings of her face, and she never got to see the spring. After the funeral, my father, Robert Calloway, went somewhere inside himself and never fully came back. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't angry. He was just absent in the way that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. Physically present. Emotionally somewhere else entirely. He started working late. Then later still. I'd hear his truck pull into the driveway at 11, sometimes midnight. He'd open the fridge, stand in the blue light for a moment, close it without taking anything, and go to bed. A man haunted by a house that used to have more voices in it. The one person who stepped into that silence was my grandfather, my mother's father, Grandpa George. Every single Friday afternoon, without fail, his old Ford pickup would idle in our driveway, and I'd climb into the passenger seat with my backpack and a change of clothes. His house smelled like sawdust and coffee. He'd been a general contractor for over 40 years. Built half the decks and porches in our county. Had hands like sandpaper and a voice that was always steady, always calm, always honest. On those weekends, he taught me things. How to reroute tile. How to read a level. How to replace a faucet washer without flooding the bathroom. He told me stories about my mother when she was young. How she used to bring him lemonade on job sites. How she was always rescuing stray animals and finding them homes. How she never once waited for someone to tell her she was strong enough to do something hard. "Your mother never asked for permission to be brave," he told me once, screwing a hinge back into a cabinet door. She just was. And then one late summer evening, we were sitting on his porch watching a thunderstorm roll in over the tree line. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed. "I'll make sure you're taken care of, Mia. That's a promise." I was 9 years old. I didn't know what he meant. I wouldn't understand for another 17 years. My stepmother came into our lives the way a new season arrives, so gradually you don't notice, and then all at once until you can't remember what it felt like before. Her name was Sandra Fletcher. My father introduced her 2 years after my mother died. I was 10. She had a wide smile and a habit of tilting her head when she listened to you, like whatever you were saying was the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard. She brought me a stuffed bear the first time she came to dinner. She cooked a roast. She reorganized the hallway closet and made it look like a magazine photo. For about 6 months, I believed in her completely. Then the rearranging started. My bedroom, the one next to my parents' room, The one where my mother used to tuck me in and sit on the edge of the bed and hum slightly off-key until I fell asleep, became the guest room. I was moved down the hall. Just temporarily, Sandra said, pressing a hand to her stomach. She was pregnant. I never moved back. My mother's photographs disappeared from the walls next. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. But gradually, one by one, they were replaced. Robert and Sandra at the beach. Robert and Sandra at a restaurant. Robert and Sandra holding up tiny baby shoes to the camera. In every frame, two people starting over. In none of them, the daughter from the chapter they'd rather not revisit. Sandra was never cruel in any way you could point to directly. She didn't yell. She didn't say ugly things. She was simply warm when there was an audience, neighbors, church friends, Grandpa George, and room temperature when there wasn't. She'd ask my half-sister what she wanted for dinner and serve it as though my chair at the table were purely decorative. She'd mention family outings at breakfast the morning after they'd happened. My father didn't stop her. He didn't encourage it either. He just occupied the narrow space between the woman he'd married and the daughter he didn't know how to face, and he chose the path of least resistance every single time. You can't be angry at someone for drowning when they never learned to swim. But I noticed. I noticed everything. And what I didn't know yet, what would take me 17 more years to discover, was that while I was being quietly erased from that family, my grandfather was quietly building something for me. Something they would eventually decide was theirs to take. Still here. Good. Because what happened next is the part that most people don't talk about, the slow, quiet kind of being pushed out that leaves no bruises, no evidence, nothing you can point to. Just a growing awareness that the space for you keeps getting smaller. My half-sister, Lily, was born in January. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. And my father transformed overnight into a man I barely recognized. He held her constantly. He took photos. He posted them online with captions that said things like my whole world, which, if you did the math, left me somewhere outside the frame entirely. Lily got the biggest bedroom. I got moved to the finished basement. One window. A bare bulb overhead. The water heater humming through the drywall like a mechanical heartbeat that didn't care whether you were okay. It has its own bathroom, Sandra pointed out cheerfully, as though plumbing were a reasonable substitute for belonging. I was 12 years old. I didn't want a bathroom. I wanted someone to notice I was being buried one small rearrangement at a time. Lily was enrolled in dance at 4, swimming at 5, piano at 6. Every season brought a new activity, a new uniform, a new round of front-row applause from Robert and Sandra. Nobody asked if I wanted to do anything. I'm not sure it occurred to anyone to ask. The one constant, the one absolutely reliable, unchanging thing in those years, was Grandpa George. He drove up every month, always the third Saturday, always with 2 gifts wrapped in the same paper. One for me, one for Lily. Equal. Deliberate. The only person in that house who treated us like we came from the same family. One Thanksgiving, after Sandra spent 20 minutes showing Grandpa George a video of Lily's recital, he found me at the kitchen sink, washing dishes nobody had asked me to wash. He studied me the way he studied a wall before deciding whether to knock it down or reinforce it. "Just wait," he said, with that slow wink of his. "Good things take time." Later that night, while Sandra was putting Lily to bed and my father was watching football, Grandpa George pulled me aside on the back porch. His voice dropped low, meant only for me. "When you turn 21, I have something for you. Something your mother wanted you to have." "What is it?" "Patience, kiddo." He squeezed my hand and didn't say more. I carried that sentence around for 9 years. Small enough to forget about most days. Heavy enough to always feel. By 16, I had 2 jobs, 1 bus pass, and the growing certainty that being invisible and being safe were not the same thing. I worked mornings at a coffee shop before school, weekends at a laundromat, folding strangers' clothes into neat stacks while my own life folded in around me. I bought my own textbooks. I packed my own lunches. I rode the 6:45 bus because nobody offered to drive me, and after a while I stopped expecting anyone to. That same year, my father poured his savings into an auto repair shop on Route 12, Callaway Motor Works, a sign with his name painted in red letters. He talked about it like it was the beginning of something real. New equipment, a paint booth, expansion plans. Sandra encouraged it loudly. She talked about growth, about hiring staff, about the future like it was a room she was already redecorating. What she didn't mention were the invoices stacking up in the kitchen drawer, or the phone calls at midnight that woke me in the basement, the voices coming through the ceiling above me in that sharp, circular rhythm that means two people who know they're in trouble trying to decide whose fault it is. I graduated high school on a Friday in June. Grandpa George sat in the front row, arrived 40 minutes early, and clapped louder than anyone in the auditorium. My father showed up somewhere in the back and left before the reception. Sandra didn't come at all. She said Lily had a stomach bug. I enrolled at community college that fall. Business administration, because it was practical and because the tuition was something I could cover with coffee shop wages if I picked up evening shifts. I lived at home for one more year, during which Sandra informed me, via sticky note, that as an adult, I would now be contributing to groceries. She had written a dollar amount. I paid it every month without argument. The auto shop closed the following spring. By then my father owed $180,000 to the bank, to suppliers, to a landlord who trusted a handshake. He took a job managing a used car lot and told someone on the phone that they'd figure it out. I moved into my own studio apartment on a Saturday, and for the first time in my life, the silence felt like something I had chosen. I was 22 years old, 300 square feet of carpet and drywall, and a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. I loved every inch of it. What I didn't know, what I had absolutely no way of knowing, was that while I'd been saving every dollar and eating peanut butter sandwiches to make rent, my grandfather had already signed over something extraordinary in my name. A house, his mother's old house on Birchwood Lane, a 3-bedroom colonial that had been in our family for decades. And alongside the deed, $400,000, transferred directly into my father's account, with one single instruction. Give it to Mia. My father signed the papers. He said he would. He said she's thrilled. And then he spent every last cent of it. There are two kinds of silence. The kind that settles after something beautiful, and the kind that falls after something breaks. I'd lived inside both by the time I was 26. But nothing. Not the quiet after my mother's funeral, not the hollow echo of a basement bedroom. Nothing had prepared me for the silence that followed 7 words spoken across a Christmas dinner table. The invitation came by email on December 19th, 14 words from a woman who hadn't spoken to me in over a year. Christmas Eve dinner at our place. 6 o'clock. Bring nothing. It wouldn't feel like Christmas without you. I stared at the screen for a long time. Sandra's warmth always had a texture to it, thick, sweet, the kind that coats everything and is impossible to trust. I almost deleted it, almost closed the laptop, and made plans to spend Christmas Eve the way I'd spent the last 2, alone in my apartment with takeout and a movie I'd already seen. Then I read the second line. Grandpa George confirmed he's coming too. I called my Aunt Carol that evening, my mother's younger sister, the one who had shown up to my high school graduation with flowers when nobody else brought any. He's back from his trip, she said. Grace, that man has been asking about you every single week. Calling your father. Calling Sandra. They kept telling him you were busy. My hand tightened around the phone. Every week, without fail. He thinks you've been avoiding him. He's worried sick. I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the math rearrange itself somewhere deep in my stomach. 2 years of silence. 2 years of thinking my grandfather had simply drifted away the way old people sometimes do. 2 years of telling myself he was tired, that he was resting. That distance was just what happened when people got older. And all that time, he had been trying to reach me. Someone had built a wall between us. And I was beginning to understand who had laid the bricks. I said yes to the invitation before I could change my mind. Hope is a terrible negotiator. It takes whatever it can get. The night before Christmas Eve, I stood in front of the mirror in my studio apartment and pulled on the one thing I'd kept through every move, every downsized closet, every fresh start. A cable knit sweater my mother had made by hand the winter before she got sick. Cream-colored wool, slightly uneven at the hem where she'd lost count of the stitches, with a small embroidered initial sewn into the inside collar. D for Diana. I pressed my face into the shoulder of it for just a moment. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the box I stored it in. Then I got in the car and drove. The house I grew up in was gone. In its place stood something shinier, newer, and paid for with money I would later learn belonged to me. I pulled into the driveway at 10 minutes to 6. The first thing I noticed was the SUV, pearl white, current model year, parked next to my father's truck like it had always belonged there. The second thing was the house itself. New siding, new windows. The garage had been widened to fit 2 cars. The front porch, the one that used to sag on the left side, the one my mother used to joke would outlive us all out of pure stubbornness, had been completely rebuilt. Fresh lumber, stained railing, the kind of craftsmanship that costs real money. I did the math in my head. My father managed a used car lot. Sandra worked 3 days a week at a dental office. The auto shop had folded 4 years ago with 6 figures of debt still attached to it. None of this added up. Inside, it added up even less. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, new sectional sofa, a glass coffee table, a flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace like a centerpiece, a Christmas tree that touched the ceiling, wrapped in matching gold ribbon and white lights, decorated with ornaments that looked like they came from a luxury catalog. Sandra met me at the door with a hug that lasted 3 seconds too long. "Mia, sweetheart, you look absolutely wonderful." She smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, the exact same candle my mother used to light on Christmas Eve. I felt it move through me like cold air through a gap in a window frame. There were 9 of us at the table that night. Lily on the couch with earbuds in until dinner was called. My father at the head, looking older than I remembered, grayer at the temples, thinner in the face. Aunt Carol, who arrived, took one look at where I'd been seated, far end between an empty chair and the wall, and immediately dragged her chair directly next to mine without a word. Her husband, Dennis, followed, settling in with the quiet authority of a man who listened more than he spoke. 2 of my father's friends rounded out the table. Ed Marsh and his wife Karen. Ed ran a body shop near the old dealership. He shook my hand and said it had been a while. Karen smiled and said nothing. Sandra presided. She circulated with appetizers, refilled glasses before anyone asked, and narrated Lily's accomplishments like a highlight reel. Honor roll, boarding school applications, a piano teacher who called her gifted. "And Mia," Sandra said, turning to me with a smile polished to a high shine. "How is the insurance office?" "Fine. That's wonderful." She had already moved on before the word left my mouth. The question had been a courtesy, not an inquiry. It lasted exactly as long as she needed it to. Aunt Carol leaned toward me. "How are you?" "Really?" Something cracked open in my chest. Just a little. It had been a long time since anyone asked that question and actually waited for the answer. "Better now," I said. She squeezed my hand under the table. I squeezed back. Then the doorbell rang. It was nearly 8 o'clock. Sandra's expression shifted, something fast and tight around the jaw, gone before most people could catch it. I caught it, and everything that came after began with the sound of that bell. Grandpa George walked through the front door, carrying a bag of gifts in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. The gifts were for Christmas. The briefcase was for something else entirely. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him. His hair had gone full silver. He moved a step slower, but his eyes were identical, sharp, steady, the eyes of a man who measured twice before cutting anything. He saw me across the room and stopped. "Mia!" I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. He crossed the room in 4 steps and put his arms around me, and I pressed my face into his shoulder and breathed in sawdust and Old Spice and something underneath, both of those things that I could only describe as safety. The same as every Friday afternoon in that old pickup truck. The same as every weekend that had kept me from falling apart entirely during those years in that house. "Let me look at you." He held me at arm's length. His voice caught. "You look just like her." I couldn't speak. He pulled me back in, and I let myself be held the way I hadn't been held in years. The way that means someone is genuinely glad you exist. He greeted the rest of the table efficiently, a nod for Carol and Dennis, a handshake for Ed, a polite acknowledgement of Sandra that carried no warmth but no aggression either. He asked Lily about school. She answered carefully. He said, "Good." He looked at my father last. Just a look. The kind a man gives someone when something significant is pending between them. My father looked away first. Grandpa George took the empty chair beside me and set the briefcase on the floor next to his feet. Clothes, within reach, the way a craftsman sets his toolbox when he knows a job is coming. He leaned toward me while Sandra fussed with an extra place setting, and his voice dropped low enough for only me to hear. "I tried calling you, Mia, for months. The number your father gave me didn't work. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I never changed my number, Grandpa. His jaw tightened. Not surprise. Confirmation. His hand found mine under the table. Rough, calloused, steady. But his fingers trembled once, and I understood. It wasn't weakness. It was fury held under decades of discipline. He straightened. He set the briefcase beside his chair the way he used to set his level on a beam. Precise. Deliberate. Ready. The question came between the turkey and the cranberry sauce, and it landed on that table heavier than anything Sandra had served all evening. So, Mia, did you ever fix up that back porch? The house is good bones, but that porch needed work when I signed it over. I set my fork down. What house, Grandpa? Silence. The kind where you can hear the candle on the centerpiece burning. The wick ticking down. The wax pooling at the base. He leaned forward. The house on Birchwood Lane. I signed the deed to your father 2 years ago. For you. He said it the way he read a blueprint. Factual. Precise. No room for interpretation. Along with the savings. $400,000. Aunt Carol inhaled sharply. Dennis set his fork down. Lily stopped mid-sentence. I looked at my father. I never received anything. Robert Calloway did not move. His hand was still wrapped around his wine glass. He stared at a spot on the tablecloth like he was trying to bore a hole through it with his eyes. Grandpa George turned his head slowly. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just the measured rotation of a man pointing a flashlight into a dark room. Richard. My father's throat moved. No sound came out. Sandra's knuckles had gone white at the edge of the table. The gravy boat she'd been holding tilted, a thin line of brown tracing down the porcelain rim. She didn't notice. Grandpa George didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Where is her house, Robert? My father lied the way he did everything. Poorly, halfway, and hoping someone else would finish the job for him. Dad, there was a misunderstanding. His voice cracked on the second word. He set his wine glass down too hard, and a dark crescent sloshed onto the tablecloth. We were holding everything for Mia until she was ready. She's been so busy with work, the move. Sandra stepped in seamlessly, the way a relay runner grabs a baton without breaking stride. We didn't want to overwhelm her. Managing a property at 24, the taxes alone, the maintenance. She's so young, and we thought. Grandpa George raised one hand. The room went silent. I signed those papers in April. 2 years ago. His voice was the same temperature it had always been. Measured. Even. The voice of a man reading numbers off a tape measure. I told you to give them to Mia that month. You told me you would. Robert opened his mouth. Closed it. What house, Robert? Aunt Carol's voice came from my left. Thin and tight as wire. It's not what it looks like. Then what does it look like? Ed Marsh leaned back in his chair, arms folded. His wife had stopped eating entirely. We were going to tell her. Sandra's eyes had gone wet, but I'd seen this performance before. At every argument, at every parent-teacher conference where she needed to appear softer than she was. She pressed a linen napkin to the corner of her eye. The napkin stayed dry. When? I said. She didn't have an answer. Neither did my father. He sat in his chair and sweated through his collar while 8 people stared at him across a table set with his daughter's money. I looked down at my plate. The china was new, cream with gold trim. The napkin rings were monogrammed. The wine had come from a bottle that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. 22 months of ramen and overtime and skipping coffee with coworkers to save $3. That was what $400,000 looked like when someone else decided you weren't ready for it. I didn't cry. I think that frightened them more than anything else. Grandpa George opened the briefcase the way he used to open his toolbox. No rush. No drama. Just a man reaching for exactly the right instrument at exactly the right moment. He pushed his plate to the side. The briefcase came up onto the table, brass clasps clicking open in a room, so quiet you could hear them separately. He pulled out a manila folder, thick, organized, color-tabbed, and laid it flat between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce like he was laying out architectural drawings. Deed of transfer, he said, sliding the first page forward. Signed by me, countersigned by Robert Calloway, dated April 23rd. He turned to the next document. Bank wire confirmation. $400,000 from my account to yours, Robert. Same date. The memo line reads, for Mia Calloway, House and Transition Fund. He pulled out one more sheet. A printed email. He read it aloud in that same level voice, steady as a plumb line dropped from a ceiling. Robert, just checking in. Did Mia receive the house keys and account details? Want to make sure everything's settled. He paused, looked at my father. Your reply, April 30th. All taken care of, Dad. She's thrilled. My father's face went the color of old cement. Sandra had stopped performing. She sat perfectly rigid, her expression replaced by something else entirely, a woman running calculations. Edmarsh stood up first. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor like a gunshot in the silence. Robert, what the hell is this? Dennis spoke next, slower, in the careful voice of someone choosing words the way you choose tools for a delicate job. This isn't a family disagreement. This is a deed and a bank transfer. This is a legal matter. Carol turned to Sandra. You knew. Sandra said nothing. And in that silence was every answer anyone needed. Grandpa George closed the folder. He didn't slam it. He placed it flat on the table, square and even, the way he'd set a finished blueprint. I didn't come here to make a scene, he said. I came here to give my granddaughter her Christmas. He looked at my father, not with rage, not with contempt, but with the patient disappointment of a man who had trusted someone to carry something important and watched them drop it in the mud. But I need to understand where her house went. He folded his hands on the table. So tell me, Robert, where did it go? My father confessed the way concrete cracks, slowly, under pressure, and never in a straight line. The auto shop, he said. His voice came out stripped of everything he usually used to smooth his words over. Raw underneath, $180,000 owed to the bank, to suppliers, to people who had trusted him. The bank had been moving toward foreclosure on this house. He had needed the money. He had told himself it was temporary. Don't, Sandra said suddenly, her voice cutting across the table sharp and clean. Don't you put this on me, Robert. You said it was temporary. You made this decision. Grandpa George watched them the way a surveyor watches two walls beginning to lean toward each other, calculating how long before the structure fails entirely. Did you use the money, Robert? My father closed his eyes, nodded. All of it. A longer pause. Another nod. The room exhaled all at once. I spoke. My voice came out quieter than I expected, but in that silence it carried clearly to every corner. The renovations, Lily's school, the car in the driveway. I looked toward the living room, the sectional sofa, the matching ornaments on the catalog Christmas tree. That was my money. My father didn't answer. That was my money. It wasn't a question anymore. Sandra tried once more. We were going to tell you, Mia. We were planning. When? One word. 5 letters. She had nothing behind it. Then Grandpa George stood up from the table, and the room watched him move to the bookshelf in the living room with the deliberate pace of a man walking a job site, checking every corner. He picked up one of the small framed photographs, me standing beside Sandra at a lake, both of us smiling in the summer sun. This was sent to me last July, he said, turning it toward the table. You told me the whole family spent the weekend at Crystal Lake. I wasn't at any lake last July, I said. I worked a double shift on Saturday and spent Sunday doing laundry. Carol was already on her feet. She took the frame and tilted it under the dining room chandelier, studying it the way a jeweler examines a setting. The lighting on Mia is different, she said quietly. Everyone else has light coming from the right. Mia has it from the left. She looked up. This is edited. The second photograph. Me at Lily's birthday party. Same problem, different shadow angle, slightly different resolution around my shoulders. The third, a family barbecue. I was wearing a blouse I had donated to a thrift store 3 years earlier. Sandra sat frozen. Her mouth opened. Nothing that could help her came out. You fabricated evidence that my granddaughter was part of this family, Grandpa George said, setting the frame down on the table with the careful precision of someone handling something that could shatter. While you were spending her money, the room absorbed it in pieces. Ed stared at my father like he was meeting him for the first time. His wife covered her mouth with both hands. Dennis reached slowly for his phone, the instinct of a man who understood that some moments needed to exist somewhere permanent. And Lily, 15 years old, sitting across the table, began to cry. Not her mother's careful, managed performance. The real kind. The uncontrolled, ugly, honest kind. Mom, she said, is that true? Sanders stared at the tablecloth. Lily learned something in that moment that most people take decades to understand, that silence from certain people is louder than anything they could ever say out loud. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. It was the loudest sound in the room. I didn't plan a speech. I hadn't prepared anything. But something had settled into place inside me over the last hour, something heavy and permanent, like a cornerstone being set into the ground. "I'm not going to scream," I said. "I'm not going to throw anything. I just need you both to hear this." Nobody moved. I spent 2 years wondering what I had done wrong. Why nobody called. Why Grandpa's number never worked. Why I was eating ramen 3 nights a week to make rent. I looked at the granite countertops, the new appliances, the gold ribbon on the tree. Turns out I was worth exactly $400,000 and a house. You just decided I wasn't worth telling. I turned to Lily. Her eyes were red. Her lower lip was raw from biting it. She looked terrified. "None of this is your fault," I said. "I need you to know that." She nodded, fast, the way you nod when you're trying not to fall apart entirely. I turned to Grandpa George. "Can we leave?" He was already reaching for the briefcase. He collected the manila folder, closed the clasps, straightened his jacket. He looked at my father one final time. "I'll have my attorney contact you Monday, Robert. This isn't over." He said it the way he used to say measure twice. Cut once. Not a suggestion, not a threat, simply a professional standard that had never once failed him. "But tonight, I'm taking my granddaughter home." My father said nothing. Sanders said nothing. The Christmas tree glittered behind them, still and perfect and illuminating a table set for 9 where nobody was eating anymore. I picked up my coat. I picked up my mother's sweater from the back of my chair. I did not look back. Grandpa George held the front door open. The December air hit my face, cold and sharp and honest, and we walked out into it together. We drove for 12 minutes without saying a single word. The snow did the talking instead. Grandpa George's truck was the same one he'd owned for 20 years. A faded blue F-150 with a bench seat that creaked every time you shifted your weight and a heater that worked hard against the cold like it had something to prove. The windshield wipers kept a steady rhythm, back and forth, the only metronome in a silence that neither of us was ready to break yet. I watched the neighborhood slide past through the passenger window. Houses dressed up for Christmas. Inflatable decorations on front lawns. Strings of lights along gutters and roof lines. Families visible through lit windows, sitting around dinner tables in living rooms and kitchens, existing inside the warm, ordinary version of the night I had just lived through. Families who presumably knew where their money was. Grandpa George spoke first. His eyes stayed on the road. His voice was quiet and even, the way it always was when something mattered deeply to him. "Your mother would have handled that exactly the same way." I laughed. It came out wet, halfway between a laugh and something else entirely. But once it started, the rest followed, and I cried the way I hadn't cried since I was 8 years old, standing in a hospital corridor in socks that were too big for me because nobody had remembered to pack the right ones. I wasn't crying about the money. I wasn't crying about the house. I was crying because I had spent 2 years believing my grandfather had forgotten me, had quietly drifted away the way people sometimes do, while he had spent those exact same 2 years trying every week to find me. I called that number 40 times, Mia. His voice was barely above a whisper. 40 times. I almost drove up last spring, but your father kept telling me you were fine. Busy. Happy. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles shifted. I should have come anyway. I should have trusted what I felt. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my mother's sweater. "How did you finally find out?" He exhaled slowly. "Dave Kessler. You remember Dave? Worked with me on the Ridgewood project back in the early 90s. He paused, watching the road. He drove past Birchwood Lane in September. Saw your father on a ladder, painting the shutters of what he knew was a house I'd intended for my granddaughter. He called me that same evening. Another pause. Dave said, "Well, why is your son-in-law living in the house you gave your granddaughter?" He didn't need to say anything else. I could fill in the rest myself. 2 months, he told me. 2 months of calls to his attorney. 2 months of pulling bank records, printing email threads, organizing documents into a manila folder with the same methodical care he had brought to every project he had ever built. Tabs, dates, paper clipped in order. A case constructed the way he had constructed everything else in his 74 years. Carefully, precisely, with nothing wasted and nothing left to chance. "The question at dinner," I said slowly. "You already knew the answer." "I suspected," he said, "but I needed to hear it from you. In front of witnesses." He reached over and squeezed my hand, his fingers rough and warm and trembling just slightly at the edges. "I'm sorry it took so long, Mia. I am so deeply sorry it took this long." We sat in the warmth of that old truck, in the blue-gray quiet of Christmas Eve, and I let myself be known by the one person who had never once stopped looking for me. By midnight, my father had called 7 times. Not once, in any of those calls or the texts that followed them, did the word sorry appear. I sat on the plaid couch in Grandpa George's living room, the same couch where I had spent 100 Friday nights reading and eating grilled cheese sandwiches and learning how to be a person who could take care of herself. And I read each message the way you turn over cards in a game you never agreed to play. "Robert, 8:47 p.m. Mia, please let me explain." "Robert, 9:12 p.m. You don't understand the pressure I was under." "Robert, 10:03 p.m. Don't let Grandpa destroy this family." Aunt Carol called at 10:30. She and Dennis had left right after we did. Ed and his wife were already pulling out of the driveway. Sandra had thrown a plate at the kitchen wall. Not at anyone, just at the wall. And my father had sat at the table for 20 minutes afterward without moving. I could picture it perfectly. The gold-rimmed china. My money shattering against the backsplash. Also, incidentally, my money. Then one final message arrived at 11:04 p.m. From Sandra. "You always wanted attention. Congratulations. You got it." 5 words. And just like that, 18 years of "I care about you," Mia dissolved the way sugar dissolves in hot water. Quickly. Completely. Leaving nothing behind but the faint taste of something that was never really sweet. I showed the message to Grandpa George without a word. He read it, set the phone down on the coffee table, and walked into the kitchen. I heard him lift the wall phone, the landline he had never replaced because he didn't trust anything that needed charging, and leave a voicemail in the same calm, unhurried voice he used for everything that mattered. "Margaret, it's George Hartley. I'm calling about the matter we discussed. I need a formal demand letter drafted first thing Monday morning. Deed recovery, full restitution, and damages. I'll have the complete file to you by 9. He hung up. He came back to the living room. He sat across from me and handed me a mug of instant coffee, the only kind he'd ever made, the only kind he believed in, and looked at me steadily over the rim of his own. "Your father wasn't asking for your forgiveness tonight," he said. "He was asking you to stand between him and the consequences of what he did. He's been asking you to do that your whole life without you knowing it." I wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat move through my palms. He was right. That was exactly what I had been doing. For as long as I could remember, I had been the cushion between my father and whatever he didn't want to face. I had been quiet when I should have spoken. I had paid grocery money to a woman who was spending my inheritance. I had told myself things were fine because the alternative, that the people who were supposed to protect me had been systematically taking from me instead, was too enormous to carry. I was done carrying it. The attorney laid out the numbers on a Tuesday afternoon, and I listened the way you listen to a doctor reading results, completely still, completely quiet, memorizing every word. Margaret Elton had been Grandpa George's attorney for 15 years. She was in her early 60s, precise in her language and her timing, with the kind of voice that made you sit up straighter without knowing exactly why. She called us on speaker from her office downtown, and I stood in Grandpa George's kitchen, leaning against the counter with my thumbnail pressed into my palm hard enough to leave a mark. $400,000, she said. Deposited into Robert Calloway's joint account on April 24th, fully withdrawn over the following 18 months. I've traced the major disbursements. She read them the way you read items off a grocery list. Flat. Factual. Each one landing like something dropped from a height. $180,000 to settle the debt on Calloway Motorworks. The shop that had failed. The dream Sandra had cheered for loudly, and my father had chased straight off a cliff. $56,000. 2 years of tuition at Ridgemont Academy. Lily's private school. The one with the spring break ski trips, and the boarding option my father had mentioned once at dinner like it was simply what their family did. $42,000. Home renovations. The kitchen. The living room. The widened garage, the rebuilt front porch with the stained railing I had admired for exactly 3 seconds before the dread started building. $38,000. The pearl white SUV in the driveway, registered in Sandra's name. $29,000. Travel. A theme park trip. Beach vacations. A lake house rental the previous July, the one Sandra had photographed and sent to my grandfather as evidence that our whole family had been there together. Vacations I had never been invited to. Paid for with money that was supposed to build my life. $55,000. Miscellaneous. Restaurants. Home decor. The matching gold ornaments on the Christmas tree. The monogrammed napkin rings on the table I had sat at the far end of, between an empty chair and a wall, while a family celebrated a life built entirely on what had been taken from me. Margaret paused, then continued. Additionally, she said, my father had used the Birchwood Lane deed, still recorded in his name since the intended transfer to me had never been legally executed, to secure a second mortgage. $120,000. The property was now significantly underwater. I set the phone down. I poured a glass of water. I drank it completely. I poured another. $29,000 on vacations I hadn't been invited to. They had used my money to build the exact memories they had excluded me from. The trips, the photos, the carefully staged family life that looked, from the outside and from my grandfather's mailbox, like something whole and happy and real. Grandpa George sat at the kitchen table across from me, his hands folded, watching me with the patient steadiness of a man who understood that some foundations need time to settle after being shaken to their core. What do you want to do, Mia? I looked at the glass in my hand, at the ceiling, at the clock on the kitchen wall that had been ticking in that same room since before I was born. I want to not be here anymore, I said. Not in this town. Not in this version of the story. He nodded slowly, without surprise, without argument. Then let's talk about that. It was the second Saturday after Christmas, and I was still at Grandpa George's house, sleeping in the guest room that smelled like cedar and old quilts, slowly beginning to feel like a person again instead of a case file, when Aunt Carol set a cardboard box on the kitchen table and said simply, I went back for this. It didn't belong to her. She had driven to my father's house the previous day. He had let her in without argument. Carol said he looked like a man who had stopped arguing about everything simultaneously, all at once, like a building that had finally run out of reasons to stay upright. She lifted the lid of the cardboard box. Inside was my mother's recipe box. Oak, worn smooth at the corners. The brass hinge that always stuck slightly before it gave. The tiny scratch on the lid, where I had accidentally dragged a butter knife across it when I was 6 years old, and deeply convinced I could open it myself. It was on top of the cabinet, Carol said quietly. Behind the dish towels, Sandra was using it to hold grocery store coupons. I opened the lid. Inside, dozens of index cards in my mother's handwriting. Her blue ink, her slightly right-leaning letters, her neat, careful print. Tomato sauce, apple pie, chicken soup, pot roast, each card annotated in the margins in that same familiar hand. Mia loves extra cheese, make double. George always takes leftovers home, make plenty. Don't let Robert anywhere near the pepper grinder. I laughed. Then I stopped laughing. Then I sat very still for a moment with my hands in my lap. At the bottom of the box, beneath the last divider, was a card that was not a recipe. A note, folded once, written on the same lined index card in the same blue ink, in my mother's handwriting. For Mia, when you're old enough. The house on Birchwood was your great-grandmother's. I want you to have it someday. Ask Grandpa. He knows. I read it 3 times. I turned it over as though there might be more written on the back. There wasn't. Just her handwriting, preserved for years inside a box that had been buried under grocery coupons in a kitchen that smelled like someone else's candles. Grandpa George took the card from me. He read it. He took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly with the hem of his shirt, put them back on. Your mother came to me when she got the diagnosis, he said. She made me promise to hold that house for you. She was very clear about what she wanted. He set the card down, gently on the table between us. She knew even then. She knew you were going to need something solid to stand on. I looked at the card in my mother's handwriting, at the careful letters, at the slightly uneven lines of someone who had written it knowing she might not be there to hand it over herself. Sandra had used my mother's recipe box to store grocery coupons. I don't know why that detail hurt more than the money. It shouldn't have. $400,000 is not an abstraction. It is rent. It is groceries. It is 22 months of choices made from scarcity that never should have been mine to make. But somehow, a woman sliding discount coupons between my mother's handwritten recipe cards felt like a cruelty that existed on a different register entirely. The kind that doesn't fit on a spreadsheet or an illegal document. The kind that just sits inside you and aches. Because $400,000 is a number. Numbers can be fought over, recovered, reclaimed through attorneys and demand letters and bank records. But a woman using your dead mother's wooden recipe box as a junk drawer, that's the kind of thing that has no remedy. That's just loss, plain and permanent, and yours to carry. The text came from an unknown number at 11 o'clock on a school night, 2 weeks after Christmas Eve. This is Lily. I'm using my friend's phone. Mom told me not to contact you. I just need you to know I didn't know. I swear I didn't know any of it. I was sitting on Grandpa George's back porch bundled in 2 sweaters and my mother's cable knit, watching the January stars through the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard, when my phone buzzed once against my knee. I almost let it go. Then I didn't. I typed back. Are you okay? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. I don't know. Everything feels broken. Dad sleeps on the couch. Mom cries at night, but acts fine in the morning. I asked about the money, and she told me to focus on school. I could picture her exactly. 15 years old, cross-legged on her bed with the door locked, thumbs moving quickly over a borrowed phone, terrified that footsteps might come down the hallway at any moment. I didn't know the money was yours, Grace. I didn't know about any of it. The school, the trips, the car. I thought Dad paid for everything. I believe you, I typed back. And I meant it completely. Lily had been given things her whole life without being told where they came from. The way children are given most things, without context, without cost, without the math ever showing through. Am I a bad person? That one took me a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because I wanted to find the exact right words for a 15-year-old sitting alone in the dark, trying to make sense of what her parents had done. No, you are not. You didn't make this decision. They did, and I don't blame you for a single part of it. A long pause. Then, Mom says you're doing all of this for attention. I almost smiled. That sounds like your mom, I typed back. Another pause. Longer. I miss you. Is that weird? It wasn't weird. It was possibly the most honest thing anyone in that family had said in 2 years. It's not weird at all, I said. And Lily, listen. Nobody gets to tell you who to love. Not even your mom. We talked for another 20 minutes after that. About school. About books. About nothing heavy, nothing that required either of us to be brave. She sent a small heart when she signed off, and I sat on that porch for a long time afterward, watching my breath cloud in the cold air, thinking about how sometimes the person you least expected turns out to be the one reaching toward you in the dark. The legal letter was 4 pages long. My father's entire defense, as it turned out, could have fit comfortably on a napkin. Margaret Elton sent the formal demand on the first Monday of February. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. Addressed to Robert Calloway at the house on Fairview Drive, the house with the granite countertops and the gold Christmas ornaments still probably packed somewhere in a box. The letter outlined, in the particular language attorneys use when they want to sound reasonable while holding something sharp, the following demands. Full restitution of $400,000, plus accrued interest. Transfer of the Birchwood Lane deed to Mia Calloway, free and clear of all encumbrances. Reimbursement of 22 months of rental expenses, $22,800, representing housing costs I would not have incurred had the property been transferred as originally intended. The letter cited conversion of assets, breach of fiduciary duty. It referenced by date and content the email in which my father had confirmed to my grandfather that the transfer was complete and that I was thrilled. He had 30 days to respond. He responded in 3. My father called Grandpa George on a Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen and heard the conversation through the wall. Not every word, but enough. The shape of it, the texture of a man who had finally run completely out of road. Dad, please. We'll lose everything. The house, the cars. Pamela will leave me. I'm begging you. Grandpa George's voice on the other side was level. Quiet. The way it always went quiet when something mattered more than volume could carry. You already lost everything, Robert. You lost it the night you wrote that email. A silence. I'm your son, and she's my granddaughter, and she's Diana's daughter, and you lied to both of us. He hung up. He came into the kitchen and refilled his coffee mug and sat down across from me at the table. He looked tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. I'm not punishing him, he said, wrapping both hands around the mug. I'm correcting a mistake. He refused to correct himself. The following week, Sandra hired her own attorney. Her strategy, as Margaret explained it to us, was severance. She intended to argue that my father had acted entirely on his own, that she had been unaware of the original gift, and that her spending had been based on his representation that the funds were legitimate family income. Margaret paused after explaining this. Then she said, "The receipts tell a different story. The SUV is registered solely in Sandra's name. The school tuition checks carry her signature. The renovation contractor invoiced Mrs. Calloway directly." Grandpa George looked at me across the kitchen table. She's positioning herself to throw him under the bus. She's always been good at finding buses, I said. By the following Monday, my father and Sandra were sleeping in separate bedrooms. The performance of the life they had built, the matching ornaments, the catalog furniture, the carefully edited photographs sent to an old man who only ever wanted to know his granddaughter was safe, was over. The set had been struck. The lights were off. And I was finally, after 26 years, about to walk off that stage for good. I packed my entire life into 6 cardboard boxes and my mother's recipe box. Everything fit in the back seat of my car with room left over. That fact should have felt sad. Instead, it felt clean, like arriving at the other side of something long and difficult and finally being able to put it down. It was the last week of February. The insurance office gave me 2 weeks' notice, a solid reference letter, and a card signed by every person on the staff. My landlord kept the security deposit, which was fair. There was a coffee stain on the carpet I'd been hoping he wouldn't notice for 8 months. I cleaned out the studio apartment in a single afternoon. 300 square feet of borrowed life. Furniture that came with the lease. A fridge with a sunflower magnet, and a birthday card from a grandfather who had never once stopped looking for me. I took the card. I left the magnet. Grandpa George had made the offer the week before, sitting across from me at his kitchen table in the same 2 chairs where we had talked through every hard thing I could remember. 2 mugs of instant coffee. A property listing printed on plain paper, folded once. I have a 2-bedroom unit in Brookfield, he said. Outside Chicago. Tenant moved out in November. It's yours if you want it. No rent until you're steady. And I know some people in the trades out there. Good people. Honest work. They'll take you on if you show up and don't make excuses. He paused. You've never made an excuse in your life. I looked at the listing, at the address, at the clean, ordinary possibility of somewhere entirely new. Grandpa, I don't want to be someone who takes things from people. He set his mug down with a quiet firmness that I recognized from years of watching him work. Mia, this isn't charity. This is what family does. The real kind. The kind that actually shows up. The morning I left, Aunt Carol came to help me load the car. She carried the last box herself, the one with the recipe box nestled inside, and placed it carefully on the passenger seat like she was setting down something sacred, which I suppose she was. She put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me directly in the way she had always had the courage to do. Your mother would be so proud of you, she said. Not because you're leaving, because you finally know you're allowed to. She kissed my forehead the way my mother used to. I held on to that for a moment longer than I meant to. Then I got in the car. I drove out of town at 6:15 in the morning. The sun was low and pale, the kind of winter light that doesn't warm anything but still insists on being there. The highway opened up flat and gray and wide ahead of me, the way Midwestern highways do, like a sentence that hasn't been finished yet, like a page that's still blank and entirely yours to fill. Grandpa George had brewed coffee before dawn and filled a thermos for me. The radio played softly. The rearview mirror showed the town getting smaller. I let it. I didn't look back for long. There is a particular feeling that comes when you finally stop waiting for the people who were supposed to show up for you and start building something with the people who actually did. It doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, the way warmth seeps into cold hands wrapped around a mug. Slowly, then completely, then you can't imagine being without it. I felt it somewhere around the state line. Just a small, quiet certainty settling into my chest like a cornerstone being placed into the ground. I was going somewhere. I had chosen it, and every single person who had helped me get there had done so freely, without an agenda, without a price. That was new. That was everything. The apartment in Brookfield was small the way honest things are small, exactly what it claimed to be, and nothing it wasn't. 2 bedrooms that were really 1.5. A kitchen with just enough counter space if you angled the cutting board diagonally. A bathroom window that stuck in the humidity. Radiator heat that clanked and hissed, and kept the place warm in a way that felt almost affectionate. My first weekend there, I painted the bedroom walls a pale blue that reminded me of early morning. I hung my mother's photograph above the kitchen stove, a snapshot from the late 90s, her standing in her classroom with chalk dust on her sleeve, laughing at something just outside the frame. I looked at it while I cooked and sometimes talked to it, which I am not embarrassed about in the slightest. Within 3 weeks I had a job, office manager at a residential construction firm. Grandpa George had known the owner for decades, trade shows, lumber yards, the overlapping networks of people who build things with their hands and trust each other because of it. He made the introduction. I earned everything after that. 2 months in, my boss pulled me aside and said I was the most organized person he had ever hired. That's because I've been organizing my life around other people's chaos since I was 10. I told him. He thought I was joking. I was not joking. Grandpa George came for dinner every Thursday without exception. We sat at my second-hand kitchen table, slightly uneven, level with a folded napkin tucked under one leg, and ate whatever I had made from the recipe box. Chicken soup, pot roast, and always the tomato sauce. "Smells exactly like your mother's kitchen," he said one evening with his eyes closed and his fork resting in his hand, like a man savoring something he thought he had lost. "That's the point," I said. Every Sunday I cooked one of her recipes. It was never really about the food. It was about keeping a conversation going with someone who could no longer answer back. It was about making sure the things she had written down, the things she had passed forward in that oak box with the sticking hinge, continued to exist in the world in some form. I started adding my own cards to the box. New recipes I had tried, written on the same lined index cards, tucked in between hers. My handwriting next to her handwriting. 2 generations of women who had figured out how to handle life the same way, one careful step at a time, one ingredient at a time, making something good out of whatever was actually in front of them. Lily texted every Thursday without fail. We never talked about her parents, and I never asked. We talked about school and books and music and the eternal, unresolved question of pineapple on pizza. She sent me a photo from her school's open mic night, her on a small stage with a guitar, nervous smile, the real kind that reaches the eyes. I sent back a thumbs up and 4 words. "You're going to be fine." It was enough. For right now, it was exactly enough. The table was small, but every single person who sat at it had chosen to be there. I was learning, slowly and with some surprise, that this was the only kind of table worth keeping. The call came on a Tuesday in September, which felt appropriate in a way I couldn't entirely explain. My father had always had a way of turning ordinary days into wreckage. Tuesdays especially, for some reason. The day my mother died had been a Tuesday. The day the auto shop finally closed for good had been a Tuesday. And now this. I was in my kitchen washing a cast iron skillet when the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in 9 months. I dried my hands on a dish towel, set the skillet in the drying rack, and answered. "Mia, it's Dad." His voice was different. Flatter, thinner, like someone had taken all the air out of it and handed it back to him empty. "I know who it is," I said. "I need your help." I leaned against the counter and watched a sparrow on the window ledge outside. It pecked at something for a moment, found nothing, and flew away. He laid it out in fragments. The house on Birchwood Lane was in foreclosure. The bank had initiated proceedings on the second mortgage he had taken against it without telling anyone. Margaret Elton's demand letter was still formally unanswered. Sandra had moved out in June, taken Lily, rented a 1-bedroom apartment across town. My father was alone in the house with the granite countertops and the new appliances and the rebuilt front porch, waiting for the bank to finish what his own decisions had started. "I know I messed up," he said. "You didn't mess up, Dad." I kept my voice even. Level. The way Grandpa George had always kept his when something mattered more than volume. You made a choice, and then you made that same choice again every single month for 2 years. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. Silence. I was trying to keep the family together. You spent my money keeping together a version of a family that didn't include me. That's not together, Dad. That's just a smaller table with better dishes. I heard him breathing. I could hear him sorting through words the way he had always sorted through excuses, searching for the one that might still open a door. Can you talk to your grandfather? Ask him to drop the case. Just talk to him. No. I paused. Not for effect. Because I needed to be completely certain I meant what came next. Not because I hate you. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't hate you. But I am done being the person in this family who loses everything so everyone else can stay comfortable. I waited a moment for that to land. That's my boundary. I hope you understand it. And even if you don't, it holds. I hung up. My hand shook slightly. Just once. I set the phone on the counter, picked up the skillet, and finished drying it. The sparrow came back to the window ledge. This time it stayed. The legal proceedings moved the way legal proceedings always do. Slowly, then all at once. The Birchwood Lane property went through foreclosure proceedings that spring. The second mortgage my father had taken against it made full recovery complicated. A house underwater in debt is not a simple thing to reclaim, and Margaret was honest with us about what that meant. Some of what had been taken would be recovered through litigation. Some of it, the vacations, the restaurant meals, the gold Christmas ornaments, was simply gone, spent into nothing, unrecoverable in any form. My father and Sandra's divorce was finalized in the fall. I know this because Lily told me on a Thursday evening over text, in the same matter-of-fact tone she had been developing over the months we had been talking. She had gotten good at stating difficult things plainly, which told me something about what those months at home had been like for her. She was living with Sandra. She saw my father on weekends. She was still playing guitar. She had written 3 songs she described as pretty good and one she described as actually good. I told her that ratio was better than most professional songwriters managed, and she sent back a laughing emoji followed immediately by a question about what I was making for dinner. That was usually how our conversations went. Something real, something light, something that reminded both of us we were allowed to just exist without the weight of everything our parents had made of things pressing down on every word. I was glad for her. I was glad, in the complicated and honest way that resists easy summary, that she existed in my life at all. The next Christmas Eve, I cooked dinner for 5 people in a kitchen roughly half the size of the one I had grown up in. It was the best meal I had ever made. The tomato sauce had been simmering on the stove since noon. By 4 o'clock, the apartment smelled the way my childhood was always supposed to smell and almost never did, warm and layered and lived in. Garlic and basil, and the slow sweetness of tomatoes that had been given enough time to become something better than they started as. My mother's recipe card was propped against the salt shaker, facing the stove. Her handwriting looking out over the kitchen like a quiet supervisor who trusted you but wanted to make sure. Grandpa George arrived first, the way he always did, early, with the newspaper, sitting at the kitchen table reading the same article twice and nodding at things only he could see. "Smells like your mother's kitchen," he said without opening his eyes. "Still the point," I said. Aunt Carol and Dennis came at 5, carrying a pie and a bottle of wine, and the specific warmth that certain people carry through doorways with them, the kind that changes the temperature of a room simply by arriving. Dennis shook my hand and told me the place looked good. Carol hugged me for a long moment and didn't say anything at all, which was exactly right. Then the buzzer rang one more time. Lily stood in the hallway, 15 years old. Hair cut short, her choice, not her mother's. A backpack on one shoulder. A nervous smile that reminded me painfully, precisely, of every time I had stood in a doorway as a child hoping someone on the other side would be genuinely glad to see me. "Mom said I could come," she said. "First time she's let me." I pulled her inside. She hugged me the way you hug someone when you're not entirely sure you'll get to do it again. Tightly, quickly, like you're trying to memorize the shape of it before it's gone. We sat down. 5 people. 1 small table. No gold-rimmed china, no crystal glasses, no 12-foot catalog Christmas tree with matching ornaments. Paper napkins. Mismatched chairs. A tablecloth Carol had brought from home because I didn't own one yet. The apartment was lit by 2 lamps and the string of plain white lights I had wound around the window frame the week before for no other reason than that they made the room look the way I wanted my life to feel. Every single person at that table had chosen to be there. Not out of obligation, not for an audience, not to maintain an appearance, or manage a grandfather's impression, or keep something constructed and fragile from falling apart. Every person at that table had simply, freely, deliberately chosen to sit down. 1 year before, I had sat at the far end of my father's dinner table wondering what I had done wrong. Wondering why the space for me kept getting smaller no matter what I did, no matter how quiet I was, no matter how much I paid and worked and waited and hoped. Tonight I sat at the head of my own table. Smaller, quieter, with paper napkins and mismatched chairs and instant coffee for dessert because I hadn't gotten around to buying a proper coffee maker yet. And entirely, completely, irrevocably mine. I didn't get justice. Not in the clean, complete, courtroom version of the word. The house on Birchwood Lane remained tangled in proceedings for longer than anyone wanted. My father still owed money he was unlikely to repay in full in this lifetime. Sandra was wherever Sandra was, in whatever version of events she had decided to tell herself, in whatever story cast her most favorably. Some things don't resolve. Some losses don't get recovered. Some people never become who you needed them to be, and the most honest and difficult and finally liberating thing you can do is stop waiting for them to. What I got instead of justice was something I hadn't known to ask for. A grandfather who had spent 2 years and 40 unanswered phone calls trying to find me. An aunt who drove across town on a cold morning to retrieve a wooden box full of index cards because she understood exactly what it meant. A half-sister on the other end of a Thursday text asking about dinner and slowly, tentatively, figuring out who she wanted to be. A table where everyone sitting at it had chosen to be there. It turns out that is the only kind worth setting. The only kind that means anything. The only kind that lasts. My mother knew that. She wrote it down on index cards in blue ink with notes in the margins. She put it in an oak box and asked her father to hold it for me until I was ready. I think I'm finally ready. I make the tomato sauce every Sunday. I always make extra. I always leave room for more cards in the box. And every time I open it, I can still smell cedar and something that might be her, steady and warm and absolutely certain that I was always going to find my way here. I just needed enough time.